Hey guys, another video for our how to do stuff in Japan playlist and our mini series on being married to a Japanese person. In the last video in this series we talked about love, the expression of love or the showing of love or the whatever, the mystery of love in a relationship with a Japanese person, and sort of mentioned briefly about it's not shown the way it is in other countries or in other sort of cultures, and maybe it's shown in other ways. Sort of mentioned that sort of briefly, and to be honest, at the time was sort of not really convinced that was true either, but that's why I didn't sort of elaborate on that terribly much. But a couple of people jumped on it and said, okay, what do you mean by that, and how is it shown? So if love's not shown in the way that it is in a lot of other cultures, and it's not expressed and shown the way it is in other cultures, how is it expressed and shown? So over the last week, I've spoken to a number of Japanese people about it, and their reactions have sort of been bafflement sort of thing. So usually the first thing they'd say is, oh, hazakashi, embarrassing. And I'd say, well, but what about, so, obviously not out in public, you wouldn't do it out in public, but what about in private? How do you think Japanese people show each other they love each other? And oh, hazakashi. So even alone with their partner, they think it would be embarrassing to show them that they love them. And a couple of people sort of said that they do things for them. So they'd say that they'd do something for them. So the ladies I spoke to said that they might make the husband, if he'd been sort of, it's interesting, the reaction I got from the Japanese people, what the Japanese people said, and I also asked some foreigners who are married to Japanese people, and it's interesting, the answers did actually line up. So the Japanese people, the Japanese ladies I asked, said that they might make the husband his favourite food, or they might make him, one said her husband likes cake and she might make him a cake, or something like that. And the Westerners who are married to Japanese people sort of said the same thing. One of them actually specifically mentioned food. He said that the way it was expressed was different though. The Westerners said, the non-Japanese people said, that American Japanese people said that they thought that if they'd been doing their jobs, if they'd been doing what they're supposed to be doing, and one guy said behaving himself, and he sort of was saying if he is doing what he's supposed to be doing. So we've mentioned in previous videos the responsibilities or the roles of wives or husbands in Japanese relationships. So if you've been fulfilling your role in the relationship, occasionally you will get rewarded. So it was sort of similar to what the Japanese people said. Of course, the Japanese people were speaking Japanese, and their way of saying it was different, but the actual physical things they were talking about were the same as what the non-Japanese people said. So that was sort of interesting. It lined up. It sort of reinforced that it would be true. However, the reactions from the Japanese people were more sort of embarrassment than anything else. The reactions from the foreigners were actually a bit emotional. One guy sort of said, "Oh, you get no exchanges at all until it's almost too late, and then you get a bunch of tears maybe, and a bit of a touch on the shoulder, and that's it." And I sort of know what he's talking about there. Sometimes if there's tension with a Japanese partner, sometimes it'll build up and no one says anything until it's almost too late, and then they sort of give some acknowledgement and some sort of touch and then move on. So his reaction was quite emotional. Another foreigner's reaction was quite emotional too. He said, oh, they say it's this, but that's all bullshit. One guy I sent an email to, I said to him, how do you think, because all of them asked the same question, how do Japanese people show love? And this guy just wrote back and said they don't, and that's all he said. That was his answer. And I wrote back again and said, well, what do you reckon? Is there any? No. So the common And again, I should clarify again, as I always do on how-to videos, this doesn't mean everybody, of course, there are exceptions, but this is generally the case. And interestingly, all the foreigners I spoke to, and all the Japanese people who are married to foreigners I spoke to, and the Japanese people who are married to other Japanese people, everybody sort of said the same thing, really. It was just expressed in a different way. That it's usually through some action, and it does seem to be a reward for your behaviour. So it's more, because what keeps coming to mind is in Western relationships. Now this can be between family members, like mothers and sons, and mothers and daughters, and fathers and sons, and fathers and daughters, and husbands and wives, and brothers and sisters, and friends. You know, in Western relationships, quite often you'll get a spontaneous showing of love, won't you? That quite often your friend or your family member will suddenly go, oh, you're a great person, and give you a big hug or something, you know? And you can just see it. You can see it, can't you? That spontaneous, particularly kids will sometimes do that. And you can see it, that it's a spontaneous, they've looked at you, or they've looked at someone else, and suddenly had this feeling for them, and they suddenly go, oh, you're great, and they give them a big hug, and oh, I love you, you know? And you do see it, don't you? And some of you might have experienced that for yourself, or seen it, people do it to other people or whatever. And it really is a spontaneous act of love, and you can see they've looked at the person's done something or said something, and they feel this spontaneous feeling of love, and they reach out and grab them and give them a big hug and say, oh, you're great, you know, I love you. And drunk men will do it with each other, won't they? Western society. Oh, I love you, man, you know, but it's, you know, it's a spontaneous showing of love, isn't it, you know? Whereas nobody said that. Nobody said that. The Japanese people didn't mention that. The Westerners didn't mention it. And one guy I was asking, he's been married to 2 Japanese ladies, and I mentioned that, you know, that spontaneous way we sometimes do that, and he just laughed. He just laughed, and no, you're not going to get that here, he said. So you do get a little bit of, when you talk to foreigners about this, foreigners who are married to Japanese people about this, you do get a bit of an emotional reaction. Even in the comments, if you look at those other 6 videos on this topic, some of the people who've written comments have been foreigners that are married to Japanese people, and some of their comments are a bit emotional, because some of this stuff is a bit of a sore point. Even if they've managed to work out their relationships with their Japanese partners and they're reasonably happy and things aren't too bad, some of these topics are really sore points, and this was a sore point when I was talking to the foreigners about this. Some of their reactions were quite emotional about it, and you could just tell. I mean, the guy with that they don't, that was his only answer, and then when I pushed it, yeah, his responses weren't happy. He wasn't happy thinking about it, you know, and it is a sore point. It is a touchy point, you know, because it's something that you do miss when you've come from a society and a culture where people do that, where people do spontaneously go, oh, come here, you're wonderful, I love you, you know. You do miss that, because you don't get that here. It tends to be more of a clinical, non-emotional response. So, and that, those guys talking about the food thing, I can relate to that one too. If you work really hard, and you've been working really hard day in, day out, and you've been working really hard, and you're tired, but you're coming home and you're still doing all the things you're supposed to do at home as well, and you're really going hard, and you're not complaining, and you're behaving how you're supposed to behave. And as we mentioned in previous videos, that's how you're supposed to behave. You're supposed to work really hard, not complain, do all the things you're supposed to do, fulfill all your responsibilities, not complain about it, keep smiling. And if you're doing all that, then what will happen is you'll come home and your favorite meal will be there, or you know, sometimes you'll suddenly get an unexpected shoulder massage, and it's interesting. We should do a video about that. It's interesting. Japanese people never touch each other. Usually don't touch each other, but when it comes to massages, shoulder massages, you'll have total strangers suddenly give you a shoulder massage here. It's just not considered to be. It's not in the don't touch rule. So you might be at a restaurant or at a friend's house, or not usually a friend's house, but you might be somewhere with a group of people and you're a bit stiff and sore. One time after skiing, I remember sitting in a place a bit stiff and sore, and I was sort of doing this, And the next thing, a guy's come around behind me, a guy that I only just met, and he starts massaging my shoulder. And you know, and that's quite normal in Japan. On TV recently, the emperor was visiting an old people's home, and he actually gave an old lady a shoulder massage. The emperor of Japan gave an old lady a shoulder massage, and everyone, you know, because that's sort of considered to be a way. It's not showing of affection at all. It's purely helping out the other person, physically helping them out, sort of thing. Hair cutters here will often do it. They'll cut your hair, and then when they finish cutting your hair, they'll suddenly start giving you a shoulder massage. First time that happens can give you a surprise, but it's not considered a sexual thing or a emotional related thing at all. It's purely just doing the physical thing for you, sort of therapeutic. It's considered therapeutic, and that's what you might get. That's what you might get if you've been a good partner and behaving yourself and doing all the right things and not complaining and trying hard. You might suddenly get a short shoulder massage. You'll be sitting there on the computer or something, and you might suddenly get a shoulder massage. And I've experienced that a lot myself, and I've also seen that a lot as well with other people as well. We'll suddenly get that. So this goes interesting. Talking to these other people about this, we ended up expanding on it, because originally it was supposed to be just talking about partners and how partners show these love for each other, and then it sort of ended up expanding because a couple of those people have kids, and so we ended up talking about kids as well, and it sort of expanded, and it really is across the board, we decided, and parents are the same with their kids. You know, there's not, if you go to a kindergarten or a primary school, elementary school in the morning and see parents dropping their kids off, there's usually not big hugs and stuff going on. Occasionally you will see a hug between a mother and a kid, but usually not, you know. They usually just sort of say, right, okay, terashai, and they turn around and walk away. That's usually the way it goes down. There's usually not a lot of hugging and stuff going on. The one that could quite often shock foreigners here is if kids are upset, if kids are crying and are really upset, quite often the parents will just leave, and we're actually going to touch on this in another video shortly, but quite often the parents will just let them cry and not pick them up. Then they'll just be talking to other parents, and the kid's crying and the parents just letting them cry. We'll touch on that in another video. It's another topic as well, but it's another example of it, you know, when a kid really, you can tell the kid needs a bit of loving, you know. Kid needs a bit of hugging and cuddling and a bit of loving. The kid's upset, you know, and the parents won't do it. Usually they won't do it. That's sort of, there's reasons for that, but again, you know, in most societies, if a kid's upset, a natural response for the parents is to hug them. That's a hard one, actually. We're going to touch on that in another video, because that is a really tough one. If you've got compassion for kids, you'll see that here quite a bit, and it really is hard to take sometimes. You really want to help the kid yourself, you know, because somebody, come on, you know. But it's just the way it is. It tends to be really clinical and really practical. So from that point of view, we're talking about this with these other guys, and the agreement was that what we were talking about really wasn't the showing of love or affection or anything like that. It was more clinical than that. It was just responses to your behavior, sort of thing. Really, like, because you're fulfilling your end of the deal, they do that, these kind things for you, you know, the nice meal or the shoulder massage or the something like that, to sort of fulfill their end of the relationship, you know. And that was consistent. What the Japanese people were saying was the same. So, you know, you can imagine if the kids are growing up in households where the parents don't show them that sort of closeness, and they don't see it. It's just not, you don't see it, you don't experience it. You know, an old friend of mine, he's actually an old person, Westerner, who I've talked to about these things, often says that it sounds like what Australia and a lot of other Western countries were like in the 50s, when people didn't show a lot of emotion to the people in their families and the people they're married to and that sort of thing. But it tended to be a little bit like this back in the 50s apparently. So it's a little bit like that. So, you know, it is a tough one, and this, again, it's just, you've got to accept it. It's a tough one, but chances are, if you do have a permanent, serious relationship with a Japanese person, that this is what you're going to find, and you're going to have to accept this, that you might miss that if you've come from a culture where, you know, hugs and spontaneous showing of affection and, you know, suddenly telling you they love you. And that's an interesting thing, actually. The Japanese people don't usually tell each other they love each other. That's a bit like the Western countries back in the 50s as well, isn't it? You know, people didn't used to tell each other they loved each other, but they will. Daisuki. Aishiteru is like being in love. Daisuki is like liking a lot. They will say it. They will say it, usually only when prompted. You know, if you say something like that to them, they might respond with that. But again, it's not usually spontaneous, and it's not done any more emotionally than saying I love chocolate. You know. Chocolate daisuki, yeah, not the daisuki. It's a little bit like that. So that's another thing, expressing it, like saying it too. That doesn't sort of happen either. So, you know, if you're used to that, or if you need that in your life, if you need people to tell you that they love you, and you want people to show you that they love you, and if you need that, you're going to be disappointed. So it's you sort of just got to accept it. And the thing is too, we've got to remember that it's not just that person. You know, if you're with a Japanese partner, you think, what's wrong with this person? You know, what's wrong with... Sometimes you cannot believe. A guy said to me once, like 15 years ago, he was married to a Japanese lady, and 15 years ago he said to me, sometimes I can't believe what my wife says to me. I just can't believe what my wife says to me. And I didn't really get what he meant at the time, but I do get it now. Sometimes you just cannot believe, you know, what your Japanese partner will say to you, because it just seems, from after we've come from different cultures, it's just not how we talk to each other and how we, you know, way we treat each other. You know what I mean? And it can be really cold. You know, you have to do this. You have to do this, and again, like was mentioned in a previous video, it's the responsibilities, your responsibilities and obligations, and the way you're supposed to behave comes before all else. Whereas in some other cultures, you know, people will sort of accept your stuff if they love you, you know, and oh well, you know, whatever. And whereas here, you're not going to get any sort of positive anything from your partner if you're not fulfilling all your obligations and doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing and following all the rules. And that's really number one. And if you do all that stuff, see, again, it sounds robotic, doesn't it? If you're being a good robot and behaving in the way that you're supposed to behave, then you'll get some positive feedback in some way. But if you're not behaving how you're supposed to behave and doing all that stuff, you probably won't. And this was consistent. This is what the Japanese people sort of said, the same thing in a different way, but it's sort of what they were saying as well. So that was really interesting, that the Japanese people and the foreigners were basically saying the same thing in different ways. And of course the Japanese people see it as normal, so they'd say, you know, moshiron, and then they'd tell you something, of course, and then they'd tell you something like, it was like, of course, naturally, and naturally enough, you know, you wouldn't show affection to someone, or you wouldn't, you know, you don't need to. That's quite often what Japanese people say, is they don't need to. That's the way they see it, is that, you know, telling a family member you love them or showing a family member you love them is not necessary, because it goes without saying. That's the sort of underlying tone from the Japanese people. So they see that it's all perfectly normal, and of course. Whereas when you ask the foreigners about it, they tend to be Yeah, oh, they don't. There's a bit of resentment. There is understandably a little bit of resentment about these things. So anyway, hopefully it's a bit of a heads up for somebody, and at least you know, if you ignore all the stuff that we've talked about in these videos and get yourself into a relationship with a Japanese person, at least when these things happen to you, you'll know it's not just them, and that you'll know that it is sort of considered normal for Japanese people to behave in these ways. And that is an important point, because if you're just thinking it's just your partner, it is a lot harder to deal with. If you accept it's a cultural difference and that they're all the same, it's a little bit easier to deal with. I mean, obviously still really tough, but a little bit easier, so anyway, there it was. Hopefully someone found that useful in some small way. More videos coming soon.